Okay, welcome back to part two of Central Asia. So we're going to start by talking about cultural geography of this region. Generally speaking, you could say this region is kind of partially divided by two. The eastern part is predominantly Tibetan, Tibetan Buddhist, and the western part is predominantly Muslim. When I say Afghanistan, most of you probably automatically associate Afghanistan with being Muslim, but most people aren't aware that the rest of the quote-unquote stands are also predominantly Muslim. And this could largely be due to the fact as well that during Soviet rule, as well as communist rule for the eastern area of this region, under both the Chinese communist rule as well as the Soviet rule, it was pretty much illegal to have a religion, to have any religious practices. In many cases, it not only was illegal, but people could have been persecuted as well. So Western Central Asia is largely Muslim, and that makes it more culturally, when we talk about the Middle East or Southwest Asia, culturally speaking, that's why a lot of people tend to clump this region in, or these countries in with that region. Then in Mongolia and Tibet, as I said, most people traditionally follow Tibetan Buddhism. And this makes Tibet more culturally linked to both South as well as East Asia. And Mongolia, although having stronger regional trends for political issues, is also more historically associated with China, or I should say more ethnic connections. But generally speaking, this is a very ethnically complex region. You will find that, a lot of the people who live in Uzbekistan are Uzbeki, for example. A lot of the people who live in Kazakhstan are ethnic Kazakhs, but not everybody. And there's also been a lot of displacement of people. Your book talks about a really interesting example where geographers studying the movement and the immigration of people going back and forth.
Estoy grabando la clase, ¿todo bien? Ok, estoy grabando la clase, no puedo hablar. ¿Todo bien? Ok, chao. Sorry.
The example is that you had a lot of Kazakhs that were displaced or decided to move, ethnic Kazakhs, and then they chose to immigrate back, and then basically the subsequent generation then chose to immigrate back to Mongolia, and now you see almost this like cyclical immigration process of people going from one country to the other. And there's a lot of, it's a really interesting little sub-article that they have in the book. They talk about how the meaning of place and homeland, what this representation for people, how it influences where they want to live and their decisions to move from one country to the other. So there is an interesting and very complex ethnic, what they're calling like a patchwork. So here they're giving you an example of Afghanistan's ethnic patchwork. And probably growing up, you've heard a lot about Afghanistan in the news, especially post 9/11. And a lot of us don't understand. We just assume it's a predominantly Muslim country. Everyone speaks the same language. They're radical Islamics, at least tends to be the people's perception. So that's why I wanted to make sure and include this map in here. You can see that it's actually much more complex than people are aware. So in the south, we have more Pashtun people, which are like tribal, and actually a lot of them, we'll talk about this towards the end, but a lot of what we view as Westerners as extreme Islamic behaviors that we associate with Afghanistan, for women wearing the burqa, for example, having to be completely covered. This isn't really an Islamic practice as much as it is a tribal practice. So it's interesting to see how a lot of the attacks and a lot of the association are against Islam, but it's against the religious, but it's not so much a religious belief as it's a tribal or ethnic cultural belief. So you can see here, just based on the languages that are present within this country, it's hugely complex, and there can be a lot of overlap and scattering of people as well. So this is more complex than we see with a lot of the other countries in this region, but it's a good example to see that it's not as clear-cut as we think. So geography of religion, as we said, the Central Asia, especially Western Central Asia, is predominantly Muslim-based, and Tibetan Buddhism is predominant in the eastern parts, specifically in Tibet and Mongolia. And as I just mentioned, the Afghan women in public, their roles and their restrictions on their freedoms is largely more associated and believed to be related to the Pashtun culture much more than specific religious practices in itself. But there is very two strong religions within this region. So culture, generally speaking, Western Central Asia is more closely linked to Russia, culturally speaking as well, because remember, they went through about 80 years of political rule through what is Russia, through the Soviet Union. And we have seen a diminishing influence and role of Russia that they play in these countries, but it still exists. You can't, in many ways, it is like a colonial legacy. Eastern Central Asia is much more, being autonomous regions, much more closely tied to China. And you see more contemporary, there's a lot of ethnic tensions because the same thing, kind of imagine what we talked about with Russification. The Chinese have taken a similar approach, and there's, I don't know if it's a forced, I'm assuming there's types of incentives for people, but Han Chinese are immigrating, which are like the predominant ethnic group within China. They are immigrating into these outer regions, which are autonomous provinces. Kind of, it's the same concept of Russification. So we're seeing more ethnic tensions developing around that, and we'll talk a little bit about some of these tensions when we get to the geopolitics section afterwards. But despite all of this, we are seeing an increased use of English. Remember, this is really quite an isolated area, especially from Western influence. So I put this map here and here. I'm not going to ask you to memorize anything from this map. I just kind of wanted to show you the political complexities of this region. So the yellow ones are former Soviet republics. This is pre-1991. Mongolia was a Soviet satellite, so it had kind of like an autonomous region, if you would. Again, pre-1991, so they gained their freedom after that. The green regions, so Xinjiang, Lower Mongolia, or Inner Mongolia they're calling it, and Tibet are Chinese autonomous regions, so they technically don't have freedom, but they want to be free. And then Afghanistan is, interestingly, we often associate Afghanistan as being a place of high conflict, and it has been a high conflict, but it's been independent since the 1700s. It doesn't really have any central authority within its country. It's been a very unstable country for the last several decades, but they've actually been able to maintain their freedom. So you can see there's still a lot of conflict zones. That's where they've put the weapons. So those are still considered to be current conflict zones. And then you can see the red areas are actually areas of border disputes. So there is, and we'll talk about the Afghan or the Pakistani-India border when we get to that in Kashmir region. We'll talk about that. I think that's the next unit. And then we'll talk about here, I've got a slide which talks about this region up here, which are, remember, these were Soviet countries. They were Soviet republics. So as being part of the Soviet republics and then gaining freedom, it's kind of amazing that that's the only contemporary border disputes that are remnants of the Soviet occupation. So to kind of give you a little bit of a history of the area, again, because this isn't an area that we generally hear much about or talk much about. So it's this thing that we refer to as partitioning of the steppes. So this region was actually a powerful center with nomadic armies. Think Attila the Hun, for example, until about the 1500s. And this was largely enabled by horse domestication. So horses, the modern horse domestication, modern horses would come from this region. And they were constantly threatening more sedentary states of Asia as well as Europe. And it wasn't until you had these advances in weapon technology, aka the invention of gunpowder, or discovery of gunpowder, that the tables were able to turn. And then finally, by the 1700s, nomad armies were defeated, and then the lands quickly started being gobbled up by Russia as well as China, or what are the Russian and combining the words now, Chinese and Russian empires. And then by about 1912, the Manchu Dynasty, which was the ruling army of China, they fell. So then you started seeing these states become independent. So Tibet and Mongolia, for example, which is where China maintains, especially with Tibet, there's like, well, previously was a state or was a part of China, and this is largely their justification for maintaining that. And then by the mid 1800s, Russia began going south. So again, these were regions that very distinct from European countries that went to try and colonize in lands farther away. These countries predominantly attempted to expand, as we talked about last week with the Russia domain. So by the mid 1800s, Russia began going south, and we saw the UK, which had India and Pakistan territory, was trying to go north through Afghanistan, which began to create a lot of conflict for Afghanistan. Central Asia was under communist rule, and then it was not long after 1970, the area was under communist rule as part of the USSR. Then Mongolia, quote unquote, fell to this, but maintained some type of independence in 1924. So they spent a long time, again, about 80 years. By 1949, we saw the communist revolution. And then communism became imposed. About 1950, we saw this huge change in Xinjiang and Tibet, sorry. And I'll talk about that in a minute here as well. Your book goes into quite a bit. But I think it's something your book doesn't talk, actually, I'm trying to think, your book doesn't talk about it as much as I think it probably should. It's kind of one of those issues that seems like people have largely just kind of given up on. Where over the last several decades, it has been a huge geopolitical situation. So in Tibet, what we basically saw as well is Xinjiang, but usually Tibet is a bit more commonly known. Local leaders were replaced with communist loyalists, and this was a way to ensure control. And then we saw subsequent, so again, similar to Russification, so immigration from Han as well as Russians, depending on the region, Russians occurred. And a lot of these attempts were the same with Russification. A lot of the attempts, the ideas were that a new ethnic group would emerge, or not so much with Han Chinese, but that they would basically outnumber and settle the regions and gain more political control. So to kind of go into the Tibetan situation a little bit more, to give you a little bit more of a timeline. So we saw the Communist Revolution. And then by 1949, China was considered a new united country with Xinjiang and Tibet. But Tibet didn't quite as easily fall. So Xinjiang is actually predominantly Muslim, and Tibet is Tibetan Buddhist. There have been lots of promises of autonomy, but it's never really been honored. It's a very warped and manipulated concept of autonomy for these regions. And because it didn't easily switch to, I guess, trying to find a nice way to say it, since they didn't just surrender to the Chinese government saying that they were now a part of their country, by 1950, the Chinese occupation of Tibet began, and it hasn't stopped. In 1959, there was a Tibetan rebellion, and this was basically led by the Buddhists, especially the Buddhists. So Tibet was, the Dalai Lama was the leader of Tibet, and the political leader was also the political leader. So there was a rebellion. He was a child at the time, but there was a rebellion, and they tried to get rid of the Chinese government. But there's actually a lot of human rights issues and a lot of horror that happened to Tibetan monks as well. There's a book, I read it years and years ago. I think it's the autobiography of a Tibetan monk. They talk about the horrors that happened during the Tibetan rebellion and Chinese occupation. It was a very violent thing. Even still today, there's a lot of issues, a lot of protesting. It's very common for monks to burn themselves alive in a matter of protest of Chinese rule as well. So the political leader was Dalai Lama, and approximately around this time of the rebellion, 100,000 people fled to India, and the Dalai Lama has been in exile since this time. He is a political representative. He's the political leader, technically, of Tibet, but it is under what they refer to as illegal occupation by China. China has declared that it previously was a state, therefore it needed, or part of their state, therefore it needed to then be part of China. This is much similar as saying, well, Texas used to be part of Mexico, or a certain area used to be, Baja California used to be part of California, whatever it happens to be. So we're just going to go in and use military force and take it over. This is virtually what's happened. And we've seen over time a mass immigration of Han Chinese to these areas, which has led to a lot more ethnic conflicts. So I'm going to ask you to stop. There's a couple of YouTube videos I have for you that really sum this up really well, and I think it's something really important to be aware about today, because it's kind of an issue that just quickly went silent. People just kind of stopped talking about it, but I think as we're seeing an emerging role with China, especially we'll talk about a little bit when we get to China, like the Spratly Island in the South China Sea. China has a standing history here of going in, invading areas, and forcefully occupying them, and saying they belong to China. By no means am I saying, I feel like I'm making China out to be this very evil country, whereas realistically they're just kind of doing the same thing a lot of Western countries have been doing for hundreds of years. But that's what I think it's something really important to be aware of a little bit. So go ahead and push stop, and then watch these two videos real quick. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of talk about a couple other issues, geopolitical issues. So, and these are current, but to understand them, we need to go back. So we already talked about Tibet. By strife in Western China, talking about in Xinjiang, so there has been a huge influx of Han Chinese coming in, but there's still a lot of ethnic tension because they're different ethnic groups. They're not Chinese. They even they're predominantly Muslim. The Chinese government, which the communist government has not taken a very liberal, autonomous stance on religion. And religion, I don't think in this region is quite so fully persecuted, but I could be very wrong. But there have been a lot of laws that, for example, they have prohibited women from wearing veils, and I'm not sure if they're allowed to wear headscarves or not, which for many people of the Islamic beliefs, that's a crucial element, something it's a very core center of modesty. And then Central Asia, in what were the former Soviet countries, the quote-unquote stands, there's been an interesting series of independence movements where they were virtually given independence and peacefully allowed independence. But again, as we've seen with a lot of countries becoming all of a sudden, while they weren't necessarily a colony or colonized, there still was a lot of political, economic, and social ties with the Soviet Union that weren't just so easily cut off. So definitely what we could refer to as similar to what we see with colonial legacies in other countries. And so this is the contested area up here that I talked about, or we saw the red lines for. I'm not going to really go into this, but this is basically a post-Soviet issue with this area that's highly contested because there are borders that have been drawn and redrawn, and today they're argued over who they technically belong to. So just to wrap up, I want to talk a little bit about the war in Afghanistan, because Afghanistan we've had a crucial role in this process for the last several decades. We still do have troops there. I believe it's supposed to be a very small number now, but it's kind of a situation where if anything were to quote unquote flare up, or the Taliban were there's supposed to be a power of a shift in power, then we would definitely most likely see increased troops being sent to this area. So the contemporary war started in about 1995. There was a series of invasions with the Russians had infiltrated, were trying to take over, and we had a lot of people who were anti-Russia, including the United States, provide weapons to the rebel groups, which eventually evolved into the Taliban. There was like a lack of organization. They eventually were able to organize. They formed the Taliban. The Taliban implemented a strict enforcement of Islamic law, which we tend to refer to as Sharia. And then we had the subsequent, so really not a lot. There wasn't too much involvement, but there was a shift of power where we were trying to keep the Russians out to protect the Afghanistans, or the Afghanis. And then there was the attack of 9/11. And then it's created we've had a standing occupation within the country. Different times we've invaded the country to try and get rid of the Taliban presence in the government. And it's a very unstable situation. But right now, and has been for a few years, the Taliban has largely diminished power, but who knows how long this will last. Okay, so we're just going to wrap up with economic and social aspects. So you can see the development indicators here. GNI, again, it's all over the board here. Kazakhstan's quite high, Afghanistan's quite low. GDP as well. So this is the growth rate. So there has been actually considerable growth for a lot of these regions, or for a lot of these countries. Sorry, Human Development Index. So again, this is 0 to 1, 1 being the highest. You can see the index is not that great, but definitely really low for Afghanistan. Percent of the population living below $2 a day. The countries with the line in them does not mean that they don't have people. It just means that there's basically no data available. So you can see for a lot of these, it can be quite low, but it can be quite high. I'm going to guess Afghanistan would be even higher than Turkmenistan. Life expectancy, again, kind of across the board. 49 is pretty low. Under age 5 mortality rate, you can see here we got 1990 to 2010. There has been a considerable drop from many of these countries. And then we look at Afghanistan, for example, 209 to 149. That's not really that big of a drop. Adult literacy. So this is, you can see it's astounding. Afghanistan has 28%. I don't know if any other country in the world we have a number that low. It'd be interesting to see. And then the gender inequality index. So again, the higher the number, the greater inequality. Afghanistan, not surprising, is very high. But recently I read an article that was talking about, I forget what the exact word was, but they were talking about more or less raising, I don't want to say a third gender, but they were raising girls as boys. This might be where they only had daughters. It might be where a father had died or an older brother had died and they had no men. And women cannot go on the streets by themselves. They have to be accompanied, even if it's by a 2-year-old male toddler. You're being chaperoned. So they've been raising, some families have opted to raise their female daughters as males. And there's this interesting point now where these girls hit puberty and they don't, imagine having all this freedom and now having to be a woman and not being allowed to go outside and having to completely cover yourself. It's this really interesting, issue, you could say, that's emerging as well with this creation of this altered gender. What we see in this region is, generally speaking, there's not a lot of exports. Some countries are doing a lot better. There, interestingly, is a very high amount of natural gas in the area. You see, largely these countries are having a monopolized export economy. There might only be like 1 or 2 things, very few things, and they're predominantly primary economic activities. So remember extraction or extraction of natural resources or growing of cotton, for example, not the processing and the production of clothing or the research, right? So there's different levels. So some of the main ones we see are hydroelectricity there's quite a potential for a lot of these regions. Kind of a couple of countries I should actually limit this to, because we've talked about how the water scarcity of this region. Mineral reserves. There are high levels of mineral reserves in some region, cotton as well as other agricultural products and oil and gas. But part of it is that it's a very isolated region. It's very dry. These are in, we saw the population density. So this is also a huge ecological impact of being able to remove these resources, extract these resources in order to be able to sell them. So here, just so you can kind of understand a little bit, this is the oil and gas pipelines. I just wanted to put this in there so you can see. So the green areas are where there's basins of oil and gas. The reds are where there are existing pipelines, and then, so those are oil pipelines and then gas pipelines, and then all of the dotted ones are actually proposed. So a big part of the issue here is extracting, and sending these off to other countries. And then again, it's just a very interesting map. You see the percentage of the population using the internet. So pretty low, relatively speaking. Total number of exports. Kyrgyzstan, for example, exports are really low. Internet use is quite high. It was just an interesting kind of like a reference we don't normally see. And then the colors are the stock of total direct foreign investment. So you can see the darker the green, the more investment. Some countries have been getting quite, Kazakhstan, for example, has gotten a lot of investment from China. And just to wrap it off with some of the gender issues and social development issues that we're seeing in this country. So in Afghanistan is a really good example where we know that there's a lot of women's rights issues. Afghanistan, interestingly, has a law that requires, I think it's 25% of their Senate, Parliament, but their political leaders are supposed to be female. So there's a little bit of there's attempts to make improvements, but these are more like in very urbanized areas, not so much in rural and tribal areas. And then I'm including this issue with the Soviet Central Asia, or post-Soviet Central Asia. Historically speaking, women have been much more autonomous, women have been much more free, but it's still a very patriarchal society. And so Kyrgyzstan has this interesting case of bride abductions. And historically, a man can go, and we make jokes about this, where a caveman comes and just grabs a woman by her hair and drags her to his cave. This is virtually what happens. So if a man can come and kidnap you, and then you are forced to marry him. And there's a lot of thought that a lot of times the kidnappings are voluntary. So if you want to marry your boyfriend, just arrange to have him come and kidnap you. However, there are still thousands and thousands of cases where it's not voluntary. And, they've tried to increase penalties for bride abductions, like legal penalties, jail sentences. However, this hasn't completely helped the situation, because they still estimate that thousands of women are kidnapped every year for this bride abduction process. And here's your summary. Let me know if you have any questions. Have a great week.